Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Miniart's first venture into some aircraft with their P-47D Thunderbolt. This is the basic edition, so let's see how I get on. So then, to get this one on the road, we're going to be starting off by having a look in the cockpit. Specifically, as you can see me doing here, I'm building up the cockpit floor. All of these parts, as you can see here, have some really nice positive locating pins, so you're not going to get confused as to where they should be going. One thing that I would quickly like to bring into the conversation is the cockpit floor. Should it be corrugated or smooth? As you can see, Miniart believe it should be corrugated, but from what I have read, I think this one should be smooth. I believe corrugated floors went out with the Razorback. If you know any more about this, do let me know. With this kit still being relatively new to the market, there aren't a huge amount of aftermarket parts available for it. However, there are one or two, one of them being this ASK set of the seatbelts, the HGW seatbelts, and also their resin 3D printed seat. As you saw from the clip beforehand, it is so thin that it's almost translucent. This just makes it feel really in scale, and yet it still has some great details on it. On screen you can see a modern day form of torture, that being 1/48 scale HGW seatbelts. They are so tiny. It was painful, I think, is the best way to get these together. However, I did stick with it and I did get a bit of footage for you, and once they were all put together, they looked absolutely superb. Definitely quite an ordeal to get them together, but what do you think? Do you think it was worth it or not? So with the majority of the cockpit all put together, as in separate sub-assemblies put together, I can now get the first bit of paint down. Firstly, I'm going to be using this aerosol format of Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black, before I can then come on top with some Ammo MIG A220, which is their zinc chromate interior green. I thin this down about 30% using their acrylic thinner, and it is being sprayed down at about 15 psi using my newly purchased Air Cobra. It was very fitting to be spraying down some Ammo MIG with the Air Cobra, as the Air Cobra is an ammo brush, and I must say it does spray very nicely, and that isn't just because it's Ammo MIG paint. I've sprayed it with Mr. Hobby, SMS, loads of different Tamiya acrylics as well, and it sprays incredibly well with all of them. It has a really great hassle-free design, but it also feels great in my hand. That is subjective though, as you know, everyone's hands are different. Talking a little bit more about what I'm actually doing with the Air Cobra, I initially sprayed all of the parts with a great flat base of that interior zinc chromate green. Nothing special there, but now what I'm doing here is I've mixed up a darkened version of it with just by adding a couple drops of black to the mix, and I'm spraying over any raised details, and this is just going to give me some fake shadow effects. So you might be thinking, wow, that looks absolutely horrendous, you know, it looks like an absolute pile of poop. However, just stay with me. What we then do is we mix up that original zinc chromate green colour again, and then we mist it back over these areas to dial back the effect and give it something a little bit nicer to look at. And there you go, it's just broken up that one-dimensional surface and made it a little bit more realistic looking. I then want to flip this entire process on its head pretty much, as I mix up a lightened version of the zinc interior green, and what I then do is actually kind of modulate it onto any surfaces which are quite flat and don't have a huge amount of details on. And the reason that I'm doing that is I'm just trying to break up those big places of that flat green colour, as it's not nice to look at, it just doesn't look realistic. But like last time, you might be thinking, yeah, but now you've overdone it, and you guessed it, we then dial it back down with that original zinc chromate green, and we're left with a nice modulated surface. With the base green down and looking very nice indeed, I then picked out a lot of those major details. By major details I mean I've blocked them in the appropriate colours, like most of the sidewall boxes and stuff are meant to be in black, and the oxygen tube is in a light olive drab colour. And to then pick out some of those underlying details which I might not be able to pick out with a brush, I then dry brush on some oil paint, and that works an absolute treat. It gives it an effect of being a little bit worn, but then it also brings out some of those hidden details, and there you go, there's the effect. Now I come back in and I pick out some of those smaller details which should be picked out, and that's just going to be using a fine-headed brush and a variety of metallic light greys, reds, and one or two yellows to jazz up the cockpit, some might say. When it comes to picking out all of these details, I exclusively use Ammo MIG's range of paint, and that is just because I really enjoy brush painting with them. They don't dry as quickly as lacquers on the brush, and it just gives a smoother and nicer finish. To once again break up a couple of areas which looked a bit too monotone in my opinion, I've mixed up an even lighter shade of that zinc chromate interior green. My goodness, that's a hard word to say. And that is just being brush painted onto a couple of the struts and raised details in the cockpit, and just once again adds to that detailed and contrasty look. And really, that was the main painting completely out of the way for the cockpit. It can then be sealed in using a semi-gloss varnish, once again in the aerosol format. I really do love using those things. And then I'm going to bring out the watercolour pencils to do some distressing. I really target all of my distressing in majorly used areas in the cockpit. What I mean by that is places where the pilot would be mucking around with it, touching it a lot. Ground crew might be using it as well. So of course the seat is being used, and also where the pilot's feet would be in the cockpit, so that is just where the rudder pedals are. All of those scratches can then be sealed in using VMS's matte varnish. I like to use this as a final finish at the moment because it gives a really matte effect, and it just brings everything to that quite nice and professional looking finish. I then get to test out the fit on this kit, and on the whole it is very good. The one thing I would say is that the tolerances are really quite small, so considering I used quite a few layers of paint, it meant that I had to scrape back, as you could see on that clip there, a couple of those layers just to get everything to fit a bit better. But on the whole, this is a stress-free and headache-free area. There you can see the aftermarket seat getting plonked into place. Once again, headache-free. Just do a lot of dry fitting with this kit, you know. Certain areas do need some scraping to get to slot into place, so just take your time and this kit will definitely treat you nicely. On screen you can see the instrument panel being slotted into place. Nice thing to note is you get 3 instrument panel decals in the kit, that completely grey one as you can see there, and 2 other ones which I've unfortunately forgotten. However, they're all printed beautifully and there's a lot of option there for you, so no need to worry there. That sidewall is then slotted into place with the rest of the sub-assembly, and it does need a little bit of wiggling to get into place, but once it does, that is your cockpit all put together. Since I've just spent about 7 minutes talking about the cockpit, I thought it was well worth spending about 30 seconds or so showing you some more in-depth footage of it and having a little talk about it. Considering this is about 90% out of the box, it is incredible, isn't it, the amount of detail in there. So if you do have one of these kits or you plan on getting one, be warned, this is a part of the kit which you really should spend a bit of time on because, as we can see, the results are pretty darn impressive. So from such positives onto quite a big negative, unfortunately, is the aerial mast is having to be cemented in between the 2 fuselage halves before you put them together. And to cut a long story short, I broke this off about 3 times during the build, and I am quite clumsy, don't get me wrong, but 3 times during a build is just insane, which could have been so easily avoided by allowing it to be cemented at the end of the build, which is what I usually do. But as I said at the beginning of the video, this is Miniart's first ever aircraft kit, so we've got to cut them a little bit of slack. Moving on now to having a look on screen at the gear bay. This is one of the most involved gear bays that I've ever done. I think there's about 20 pieces completing both sides of the gear bay, which is immense, isn't it? And you know, the proof is in the pudding. They are so detailed. It is absolutely incredible. You don't have to spend a huge amount of time either doing picking out all the details, because you put a wash in there and boom, they're all just right there in your face, and it looks absolutely great. The ailerons are made out of one piece, which I found very impressive because there's a stupid amount of detail on them in regards to rivets and also raised details, etc, etc. However, the flaps are a different story. Unfortunately, they are made out of 2 pieces. However, it's not all bad news as they have a very nice audible snap once you're in the right place. Once they've been cemented together, they can then be cemented into the wing. There's once again a really nice locating slot for them, so yeah, you're not going to be worried about getting these in the wrong places. One thing I would like to note though is that there is no option in the kit to have your flaps extended. So if you want to have them extended, you might want to think about potentially getting the advanced kit, which I believe gives you some actuators to put them in the drooped or extended position. The 2 fuselage halves can now be cemented together with the cockpit tub inside, and also for now, emphasis on for now, the aerial mast is there. These went together very nicely, no fit issues at all, just a little bit of tape needed to keep them pressured together while I was getting some glue on there. Although this kit is incredibly detailed out of the box, I did think it would be a good idea to do one or two little modifications which wouldn't hurt me too much. One of those modifications is going to be putting some ignition and spark wires onto the engine. The engine detail itself, as you can see on screen, is incredible. You know, all of that recessed detail is so impressive on such a small scale. However, what was I doing on screen? So I initially came in with my Dremel and a micro drill bit and drilled out all of the lovely recessed areas where the ignition wires should be going. Once they were all drilled out, I came in with some extra thin cement to make sure that any plastic gumph that was there had been evaporated and melted. And then really what I did is cut out two different lengths of wire. There was a longer one which was going to the rear piston heads, and also one which was shorter going to the close piston heads. These were cemented in place using some extra thin CA glue, and it was I felt a little bit like a surgeon popping these into place. Try not to get too much super glue on any of the surrounding pistons. However, once they had all been cemented into place and they were at the right length, they can then be bent. These were bent just using a pair of tweezers and getting them into the appropriate locations, and I didn't cement all of them until I had them all bent into place, just so I knew how much space each of them was going to need and make it look relatively equal, because I've done it before and all the wires were all over the place and it looked like an absolute shambles. But once they were appropriately in the right place, they could then be trimmed to shape. A dollop of CA glue is fitted to all of them to just make sure they don't move too much, and then we can go on to a little bit of paint. I painted the entirety of that sub-assembly up with some super metallic 208, which is super duraluminum. I do love saying that word. And then all of those details can be made sure to be highlighted out using a Mr. Hobby Ground Brown wash. This was heavily thinned using some white spirit, as straight out of the bottle it's a bit too thick. One thing that I absolutely love about the super metallic range is that they're really quite durable, so you don't need to worry about putting a gloss varnish or any varnish at all over them if you're just going to be using some white spirit and also a little bit of a wash. The Decals solutions are another story, but we can cover that when we get to it. I can now highlight all of those ignition wires in RLM04, also known as Gelb. This was just a colour which I kind of chose because it looked quite accurate to a couple of photos that I'd seen. If anyone knows the exact colour I should be using, do let me know. And that was the main engine all put together. To continue in the detailing process, I'm using kit supplied parts here. This is all out of the box again. They do need a little bit of persuasion to get into place just by using some tweezers and kind of clicking them into the right place. Nothing major here at all. I did have a little play around with the locating pins, as they didn't give me the fit that I wanted, and I was a little bit concerned that it might give a bit of a squiffy look to it. So they were just chopped off and I butt fitted everything. For this next part, I wasn't completely convinced that I'd be able to line it up straight away on the dry fit. So what I did is I used Ultra Glue here. Ultra Glue is a product by Ammo, and it's pretty much a PVA, but it's got resin in it, so it just dries super strong, almost like a CA glue. But it doesn't go off as quickly as CA glue. It gives you a bit more working time, and it just gets everything into the right place, and it doesn't fog anything or leave any weird residue. And with this final piece being cemented on, that was the engine completed. Wow, very impressed with this engine again. Very similar to the Cockpit, involved but really impressive. But I think this is an advert for buying the blimmin' advanced version, because then you have to put all of your hard work and encapsulate it in a cowling. So it did pain me a little bit that you might see some tears rolling off. That's just because I'm a little bit sad that I have to encapsulate all of this. But then talking about the cowling, right, it's interesting. It's potentially not the greatest way that cowlings can be done, especially as you have a lot of one-piece cowlings, or Edward who use a jig to create the cowlings these days. As you can see, quite a lot of pressure is needed to get the cowling in the somewhat right vicinity, and then after that I also have to use some putty around certain gaps to make it look a little bit more streamlined. But it's nothing that basic modeling can't do. If you've made a couple of kits in your time, this won't cause you any issues to sort out, but there might be some issues to sort out. The cowling flaps are absolutely fine though. They have really nice locating pins, well no, not pins, almost tabs I guess, and they slot around the entire cowling without an issue at all. And that was the engine and cowling assembly all sorted out. Moving back to the fuselage now, here you can see me putting the kind of the anti-glare shield and also that front piece in place. That doesn't have the greatest fit either, so do bear that in mind. That needs to be sorted out with some filler and putty as well. But it's annoying because the entire kit is so beautiful, and you know, just look at the underside of this wing, you know, look how crisp those panel lines are and the lovely riveted detail. And what they've tried to do in a couple of these places is they've tried to put a panel line across where there should be a panel line, you know, they've tried to make a seam where a panel line should be, and the rest of the model is so crisply done that it just stands out like a sore thumb because it isn't as crisp. Like it's only a small percentage not as crisp, but it's not as crisp and it just stands out, which means you do have to sort it out. But it's an incredibly valiant effort, and I really do hope that they continue to try and do stuff like this, because I'm sure eventually they will crack the code and you'll almost have a Tamiya-esque kit. Anyway, after that little spill of emotion, I guess, talking more about the kit, here you can see the wings are getting cemented into place. They have a really nice fit as well. The one thing I would say is that you have to sand off a little bit of the edges of the gear bay to get them to have a really tight fit. I did have to spend a couple of minutes thinking, why isn't this fitting as well as I want it to? And all you have to do, sand off a little bit on the where the gear bay is, and it will go in like a glove, I promise you. Now, having a look at the rear of the aircraft, here you can see me fitting the elevators. They do need a little bit of persuasion to get them into place, specifically taking off a little bit of material on those two tabs just to get them to go in a little bit easier. But once they are in, you do have the benefit of them being movable, so you can position them in any way you want to. The cowling and engine subassembly can now be cemented onto the front of the aircraft. There are two very prominent, as you can see on screen, locating pins, ensuring that you get a really solid and also the correct positioning on your fit. But with the engine on, we were pretty much ready for paint. So what I did now is I absolutely massacred some sponges and started stuffing all their little bits and pieces into areas which I didn't want to get covered with paint. So on screen you can see me stuffing it into the front end of the cowling just to make sure none of that primer or paint gets onto the engine. Another neat little thing that Miniart do include in the kit is the gear bay doors in the closed position, and if you're a little bit smart you can actually use them as a paint mask. The only thing that you do need to do is unfortunately snip off the actuators in the gear bay, but I think it's a small price to pay. I can then whip out yet again another aerosol, but this time I'm going to be using Mr. Surfacer 1500 Grey, and that is just lightly dusted over the surface. I say lightly dusted, and I mean lightly dusted, because imagine filling in all of those lovely rivets that Miniart spent so much time tooling. So as you can see on screen, I'm showing off what scheme I'm personally going to be doing my P-47 in, and that is going to be the David Schilling scheme. Definitely a very iconic scheme, and I'm sure you've seen many a rendition of it. However, this is how I'm going to take on mine. So what I wanted to do first is get out the most monotone part of the scheme, and that would be the underside. So this will later be painted in a lighter grey sort of colour, and to really break up this quite monotone and dull looking underside, I'm going to be using a technique which I haven't used since August last year. And as you can see on screen, that technique is going to be the panel line shading. So what is panel line shading and what is it actually trying to do? Panel line shading is where you take a darker colour, usually black or dark grey, and you trace very carefully with your airbrush over all the panel lines. So what it tries to do is it tries to create some fake shading and also draw some attention to the panel lines on the surface. You'll see when I naturally spray over in the lighter grey colour that all of those panel lines are more drawn to your eye, and that is just because they will be in a naturally darker grey. What this does is it just breaks up the surface and gives it a little bit more interest, very similar to what I did in the cockpit earlier on in the video. A downside to the technique is it isn't as controllable as something like post shading. Post shading, you really do have a lot of control over how intense you want the effect to look or not. Whereas here it is a pre-shading effect, so that colour which you can see me dusting on now is really going to be what determines how much of the effect you can see or not see, and it's very easy to overdo and lose all of your hard work. However, if you are patient with some very fine coats, you will get an effect which looks much better than just a plain monotone grey.
This is a great start, however, I really do think that we can do a little bit more with it. So this time I'm going to be getting out an even lighter grey, you could use white here, and now I'm going to be going over all of those rivet lines that Miniart has provided. The reason that I'm not using a black here to highlight all the rivet lines is it might just get like a big kind of darker grey mess when I blend it back in, and I wanted to differentiate between the rivet lines and also the panel lines. As you can see here, it does take a little bit longer to highlight all of them. I've even taken off the crown of my airbrush to help me get that little bit closer. Talking more about the actual kit here, the amount of details and rivets that Miniart do provide does make the painting experience far more engaging, and just really thinking, how can I get these details to stand out and how do I make other details not stand out as much? It's a lot of fun to have a little play around and really challenge your painting abilities. So if you are a seasoned modeler, you will have a lot of fun painting this. Now that all the rivet lines down, I can then once again blend them in with that original medium sea grey colour that I'm using. Talking more about what paint I'm using, you might have seen that when I showed the bottle of the medium sea grey, it was an SMS bottle, and that is what I'm using for the underside of this build. No real specific reason why I'm using it, except for I do like how it sprays, albeit I do like to put 1 or 2 drops of Mr. Leveling Thinner through it just to help it go through my Pro Convoy a bit nicer. But the actual tone of the paint looks really good as well. And the final effect that I want to use for the underside of this build is a technique which I'm not too sure of the name of. I seem to be using it quite a bit anyway. All you do is you use some masking tape, you mask off separate panels, and then you mix up a slightly darkened version of that medium sea grey and flick the paint across the panel. This gives this lovely idea of fake streaking and almost a bit of shadow effect there as well, and I really like how it looks. And keeping the masking tape out, I had the joy of masking off some invasion stripes. Oof, god, I really don't like doing them on the underside or around curves, much prefer doing them on the wings. This was just done using some of Ammo Mig's flexible, or like curve tape I guess it's called, and also some Tamiya, and that ammo stuff works really well. If you use the Tamiya flexible tape before, I really recommend giving this stuff a try because I think you might prefer this stuff. It just seems to go around curves a little bit better and also has a nice amount of tackiness. So with the underside all completed, we can have a look on the upper half. I'm going to be using C361 and 362 for the colours. One of them is the dark green RAF colour and the other one is the ocean grey colour. Initially spraying down the darker of the two, that is the dark green. It is just sprayed in a uniform coat, no special techniques here or anything too fancy, just trying to get a good base for the ocean grey to go on top of. When it comes to what am I spraying with and how am I spraying it for this build, I'm using my Pro Convoy almost exclusively. That is a 0.2mm and I absolutely love that brush. And the dark green was sprayed in a mixture of 60% thinner to 40% paint, and still keeping the PSI at around about 15. So once I was happy with that base coat, I could then come on top with the ocean grey. If you are familiar with Schilling's scheme, you know it is very intricate and has all of these ocean grey squiggles across it. I was initially blindly following the Miniart paint guide, and it showed that these ocean grey squiggles had a far softer edge to them, and they almost were like morphing into the green, which I thought was a little bit abstract, but I did do a quick Google search and realised that that is actually not what I saw. I instead saw that it was far harsher and a far more hard-edged camo, so that is what I tried to replicate. So what I did is I once again whipped off the crown of my airbrush. I thinned it down to a percentage of about 80% thinner to 20% paint and really started to almost mottle it into place. Once again, looking at some photos, it seemed that it wasn't a constant or a very uniform layer of paint. This ocean grey actually was quite patchy, as you know, understandably it would have been done in a field with loads of the environmental effects going against them. So to do this, I kind of mottled the paint on. You can see me hopefully kind of doing small movements, not trying to get it completely uniform, instead trying to make it a little bit patchy and a bit all over the place. But I must say, this was one of the most challenging schemes I've done for a very long time. Firstly, mentally, you know, trying to keep all of those squiggles looking relatively the same and the same sort of patchiness was a big challenge. And then also physically, for the first time in a long time, my trigger finger felt like it was going to fall off by the time that I was done with this. However, I think the result was quite good. If we compare it to the real aircraft, I think there's quite a strong resemblance, so that's all that I'm worried about. I now have the very satisfying job of peeling off the masking tape and seeing what damage has been done underneath. Unfortunately, there was a small amount of overspray which had to be sorted out, but at least they were just block colours like the medium sea grey and also white, which are very easy to just patch up, let's just say. So now I had the rather interesting task of trying to jazz up, let's just say, the scheme. It looked very one-dimensional at the moment, and if you compared it to the underside, it just looked a bit out of place. So once again, using the ideas which I had from the underside, I'm just going to apply it to the top. On screen now you can see me using a lighter grey to highlight all of the rivet lines, and you can also see that I've already done that on the green colour, and it helped to bring out all of those rivet lines. I didn't want to over accentuate them with a wash later in the build, as I thought having a load of black dots all over the aircraft would look a little bit odd. So once they were all there, I actually didn't blend them in that much at all, as I think when I would put layers of varnish on top later, a lot of them would be hidden. So it was time to unfortunately put on my big boy pants and take the risk and gamble and see if this was going to work. After I'd done all the rivets, I still think that it was missing something, and that something that it was missing was some post shading over the panel lines. On the underside, I did the pre-shading with the black, and that is how I created that faded or like depth look around the panel lines. However, this time I hadn't done it before, so I had to do it on top. To do this, I used a very highly diluted black colour and was sprayed over all of the panel lines like usual, and then I had to blend it back in using the original colours. It took a while, and there were a couple of failed attempts, and there was a lot of switching between the ocean grey colour and the dark green colour, trying to make it look as good as possible. However, with enough patience, I managed to make it look respectable. And finally, I could say that the majority of the painting and the main scheme had all been finished, and I was very, very happy to put this behind me, but I was also incredibly happy with the result, as I personally think that this was some of my best airbrushing work to date. Hopefully the photos will show you what it looks like, and if you would agree with my statement. And I really do think that the reason for this scheme coming out so well is down to how well I get on with my Pro Convoy. So I'm not saying that the Pro Convoy is definitely the brush for you, because you don't know until you actually have it in your hands, and that is the same for any brush. And that is why Hannets in London is so valuable. So if you are in the area and you are into modelling, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you go and check them out. Considering it is stacked from floor to ceiling with paint, model kits and more, I would be very, very impressed if you can walk out of there without your next project. So I do hope to see you down there soon, and yeah, let's get back on with the video. So on to some more basic painting. This time I'm just doing the accent yellow tail and also the red part of the cowling, I guess. It's not really a nose cone, is it? But they are just painted up very, very basically, and they are just post shaded using some shaders. Shaders are absolutely great, however, do make sure that you use them on a matte surface, otherwise all they're going to do is pull up, as they're just watercolour. So whenever you're spraying down a red or a yellow colour or one of these really, really vibrant colours, it is a great idea to have a nice solid base underneath it. Usually white is a good idea, a nice solid white base. Considering I had squiggles underneath it beforehand, I think it would have come out a little bit weird if I didn't have a nice base on it. With the masking tape removed, you can see that it is a great accent on the front of a very, very unique scheme. And with the painting almost completely out of the way, it's time to turn my attention to some smaller little bits and bobs. On screen now you can see one of the £1,000 bombs which I had, and if you're wondering what is that weird gumph on it, I wanted to try and recreate a cast iron or cast texture on the bomb. So how I did that is I got some Mr. Dissolved putty and I just stippled it on there, and if you keep on doing it, just keep on doing it, even when you think it's dry, it will start to kind of rip up and give these nice sort of abraded texture. The amount of ordnance that Miniart do give you in the kit is insane. There's smoke grenades, there's all different types of bombs, there's blimmin' bazookas, there's absolutely everything, so you definitely won't be short for choice. I now get to try out a new tool, and I've been wanting to use this for a very long time. So first what I do is I take a measurement of the nose of the bomb, or at least how much of the nose I want to be covered in yellow. I then transfer that measurement over to my new disc-based circle cutter, and I line it up and do a little twist, and oh my goodness, a perfect circle mask appears. I might be overreacting to how cool I think that is, but oh, it was so satisfying doing that. And look, the perfect circle, it comes off. I mean, it's not completely perfect because I don't think I applied it completely centrally, but yeah, it looked good and it's a nice circle. And now we can move on to glossing everything in preparation for decals. And just like that, in a blink of an eye, they are all on. I didn't do much filming of the decal process because I'm sure everyone knows how a decal goes on, and I just wanted to make sure that I got them all on, looking very, very good. As you can see by the video, they have perfectly captured the detail underneath, and that was using some Mr. Mark Setter and Mr. Mark Softer. The decals were printed by Cartograph, so of course this isn't a huge surprise, but you know, it's a great addition to the kit and really does help the process. Once they are fully conformed and they had been left to dry for about a day, they were once again sealed in with a layer of gloss varnish before then using a Mr. Colour panel line wash, which is ground brown I believe, diluted with about 50% of white spirit and then dabbed with capillary action into all of the panel lines, and then as you saw in that clip, wiped off in the direction of airflow using a clean towel. And as you can see by that video there, it really does accentuate all that shading that I did earlier in the painting process and just makes it look a little bit more complete and a bit sharper. I can then use a flat varnish to get rid of any of that quite ugly, maybe not ugly, but it didn't look right seeing this scheme in gloss, so that just dials everything back down. I can now use some ash black shader to then weather in the decals. The reason for me using this shader is because if you compare it to the lovely shaded surface around it, the decals just look very, very clean and pristine and almost a bit out of place. The reason that I put the shaders on now and not after the decals have just been put on is because the matte varnish really does help the shaders grip into the surface, and here you go, it just looks a little bit more weathered in and a bit more uniform. And for the first time in a very long time, here you can see me putting together some sub-assemblies, specifically the wheels and the wheel hubs. To paint those wheel hubs, I did in fact use my fancy little disc-based circle cutter again to get that lovely crisp line. The wheels themselves look absolutely great with that lovely diamond cross pattern. The one thing I would say is I did struggle to get rid of that seam line around the centre. The amount of sanding that I did, it started to destroy the shape of the wheel, so I thought I'd just take the seam line on the chin and roll with the punches. The landing gear legs can now be assembled. These have some lovely locking mechanisms ensuring that you have a super strong fit. A tip for all of you out there, if you are putting these landing gear legs in, put them in at an almost horizontal angle and then do a twisting motion, as can be seen on screen here, to get them to then snap into place. It could be a good idea to do quite a lot of dry fitting beforehand. I think I dry fitted about 3 times before I actually committed to some glue. Little bit of a technical part of the build, but stick with it and you'll be fine. The final gear bay doors can then be cemented on, and also the tail wheel assembly was done off of camera. It has great fitment as well. There's really nothing for me to report. It has a very, very similar stage to what you saw here. And just like that, she is on her legs. As you can unfortunately see there, some of the wheels do have that really annoying stubborn seam, which I couldn't seem to get rid of. But hey, you live and you learn. The previously painted ordnance can now go onto the aircraft. Here you can see me just showing you them. These were all cemented on using some CA glue, and all of the locating pins and slots work absolutely flawlessly. The one thing I would say is that the actual locating slots are quite small, so definitely do some dry fitting beforehand just so you know where they should be going. So the mighty jug can then be flipped onto its legs, and then we can have a little chuckle about how small this locating tab is for the propeller. Look how small that is for such a big propeller. Do be careful here. Make sure you use some fast setting CA super glue just to make sure that it doesn't go anywhere and you have the right geometry. You wouldn't want a drooping prop at this stage of the build. It does go on fine though, just a little bit humorous. So onto the final bits and bobs now. The canopies can be masked off and also painted in that lovely silver colour. I made sure not to put them on the build beforehand as I didn't want them getting drenched in matte varnish and ruining that lovely shine. They can then be plopped onto the aircraft, some rigging can be secured, and that is this build all wrapped up. So a very big thank you to Miniart for supplying a review sample of their fabulous kit for me to have a little look at. Also, if you are interested, this should be featured in a Phoenix Scale Publications article or something like that in the near future. So if you are interested about that, I'll leave some links and some information to them down below. So all that's left is for you guys to have a little look at the model. So without any further ado, thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope that you've enjoyed it. Enjoy the final photos and videos, and I'll see you next time, guys. Bye bye.